That's a big question. I am Ibrahim Tanko. That's my name. My surname is Amidu. I got the name Tanko because I was born after a number of girls. I think in northern Ghana, if you are called Tanko, it means that you were born after at least 3 girls. And my mom had 9 children, 8 of them girls. So I'm a double or triple Tanko. I come from the north, specifically from Pusiga in the Upper East region. My mother is from Yendi in the northern region. I am married with 4 biological children and countless other non-biological. My education, I have a master's degree in social policy. But interestingly, my first degree was in accounting from the University of Ghana, Legon. And I'm currently pursuing a PhD in social policy at the University of Ghana. I think I've always had a passion for development work. Right from my secondary school days when we had were part of the Current Affairs Club. I was part of the SRC, through to my days at the University of Ghana, Legon, where I was the SRC president for Legon in 81, 82. So I found the accounting work quite limiting. The reason why I went to do accounting actually was that in those days, if you went to the School of Admin, it was the most prestigious course after medicine, and so everybody was looking forward to doing admin and etc. So I went there, but I realized that it was quite constricting. And so even when I was working as an accounts officer in my first NGO work, I took part in the field work. I helped the staff in writing reports and etc. And so it was quite easy to move from accounting to mainstream development work. But I think that background has helped me a lot because as the head of an organization, if you can't read the accounts, if you can't read the financial reports and etc., it limits you. It limits your effectiveness, and so it wasn't a waste to doing the accounting. Well, it's been checkered. I started work with a government organization in those days, the late 80s. We had what we call the regional development corporations. Every region had a development corporation. So my first job after national service was as an accounts officer with the Upper East Regional Development Corporation. And then I worked briefly with the Customs, Excise and Preventive Service, SEPS, also as an accounts officer before I got my first job in development, which was with a Danish project in northern Ghana called the Ghanaian Danish Communities Program. I went there as the accountant administrator and ended up, as the program coordinator when Danida decided that they wanted to scale up the funding and needed an overall coordinator. From the Ghanaian Danish Community Program, I moved to CARE International as the Northern Ghana Programs coordinator from 2000 to 2005, and then to VSO, that's Voluntary Services International, as the country director for Ghana. From VSO, I found my way to Star Ghana, and that's where I have been since years. Star Ghana Foundation started as a donor program in the early 2000s onwards. There were these discussions about how to make development more effective. So you had the aid effectiveness conferences, you had the Accra Declaration, the Paris Declaration, etc., all on aid effectiveness. And one of the key principles of aid effectiveness was this whole thing about harmonization, that the donors needed to harmonize their approaches. They needed to work more closely together to enhance effectiveness, decrease duplication, etc. And so with this aid harmonization came the concept of basket funds or pooled donor programs. Now, a basket fund is actually a program or a mechanism that is funded by a number of donors to implement their programs in the country. So Star Ghana was set up by 4 donors, the UK as the lead donor. The organization was then called DFID, Department for International Development for UK aid. Then you had the European Union, you had the American USAID, and then you had DANIDA, that's the Danish International Development Assistance. So these four donors put their money together into a program called STAR Ghana. The STAR at that time stood for Strengthening Transparency, Accountability and Responsiveness in Ghana, but now it's just STAR. So the STAR Ghana program was set up to manage donor funds in support of civil society organizations, to strengthen civil society and to improve access to quality health and education services for underserved populations in this country, and to strengthen governance. So STAR was implemented over two phases. The phase one was from 2010 to 2015, and the phase two was from 2015 to 2020. So the STAR Ghana program was for 10 years in all. And we managed a total of approximately 75 million US dollars over the period, and supported well over 270 Ghanaian organizations during that period. Before the program ended in 2020, it was decided, or the Ghanaian side pushed, that hitherto we've had all these short-term programs. So there was the Rise and Voice Initiative, RAVI, 5 years, it ended, and that was the end. There was the CASA program, 5 years, it ended, and that was the end. There was GRAP, which was the Ghana Research and Advocacy Program, 5 years, it ended. And we thought that it would be a pity for STAR, after all that, to also, after 5 years, to end, and then move away. You don't solve the underlying causes of poverty and inequality and underdevelopment with a 5-year program. It needs a more long-term intervention. It needs to be sustained. The support needs to be sustained. The advocacy needs to be sustained. And so the push was made by the advisory committee, the steering committee of the program, led by Professor Akilakwa Sawyer, to take over the program and manage it as a Ghanaian organization. It was. So STAR Ghana as a donor program ended in 2020. Then the STAR Ghana Foundation was set up. It was launched in 2018. So we had a 2-year overlap period, and then 2020, when the STAR Ghana program ended, we started the STAR Ghana Foundation as an independent, Ghanaian-owned, Ghanaian-led organization. And we've been operating as a foundation to date. One is the fallacy that NGOs or donor programs can change or develop. They can't. No, they can't. They need to collaborate and to work with governments. Like I was even talking about these programs coming for 5 years and going. So when you go, who is there to continue? Now that Trump has decided that, look, we don't want to give you any money anymore for NGOs and civil society. Who is doing that? So I think the first is to establish collaboration between civil society and government, that we are working towards the same objective. If it is on education, maybe my program can fund 50 projects in education. That is a drop in the ocean if you compare to the need across the country. So the first, I think, is that collaboration, that government and civil society and donors agree on what needs to be done and who should do what. And I think one of the reasons why STAR Ghana succeeded so much was actually this point, particularly our work with Parliament, that we actively worked with Parliament to ensure that they were able to exercise the oversight, function, So now a lot of the things that we helped Parliament to start between 2010 and 2020 are the things that Parliament is pushing on. Nobody mentions STAR Ghana when they talk about the private members bill, but we funded the analysis, the work that led to the passage of that bill. Nobody talks about STAR Ghana when they are looking at the amendment of the standing orders, to allow a lot of these things. We funded that. Affirmative action, we did. But we worked through Parliament. So even when the program ended, Parliament was able to take these things forward. I think the second that I would recommend is a domestication of the donor programs. Yes, we know that there's nothing like a free lunch. So when USAID, EU, DANIDA, DFID put their money into the STAR Ghana program, of course, they also had what they wanted to achieve. But we took that and said, so what does that mean for us in Ghana here? And so we made a case, and therefore nobody saw Star Ghana as a foreign thing that had been brought to come and do what donors want to do in the country. We domesticated the program, and so everybody saw the value that we were providing. I think the third is the whole issue around leadership, the quality of leadership. We are very cynical about our leaders in Ghana here. So as soon as they hear, say, oh, these people, they don't mind, they chop the money. But you need leadership that demonstrates integrity and is not afraid of being held to account for what it does. I mean, between 2010 and 2020, the number of audits that we went through as Star Ghana program, the number of evaluations, and not one single time, no. And so that gave confidence to everybody that, this is something that is worth supporting and etc. We should start everything with why. Somebody said that if you have a why, you can withstand any what and any how, But we usually jump into things without asking first, what do we seek to achieve? The purpose should determine everything. And so I think for us in Star Ghana, we've been very clear about why we needed Star Ghana. And so we've been very focused on what we seek to do and how we seek to do it. If you are not focused, you don't understand your why, you just jump into everything and therefore the slightest listen throws you off balance. The second, I think, is nurturing staff. That staff are also stakeholders. Nurture capacity, let people become part of the decision making and etc. The third, it's looking at how we can mobilize resources locally. Depending on the donors is not sustainable. The Dutch government got up overnight and they cut 3 billion euros from their development budget. And so they said from next year, they were even kind enough to say from next year. Trump announced in January that by the end of February, everything, So until we start looking at local philanthropy, how do we fund our own development processes? People will see this as, it's for the foreigners, But where we are able to promote local philanthropy, then it means that citizens will see what we are doing of their own development initiatives and will be willing to support it and sustain it. Actually, there's this global conversation around the concept of shifting power, that we need to shift power from where we are looking at, being accountable, well, some say upwards, but I don't want to say upwards, but just accountable to the donors, to a state where we are accountable both ways. Shifting the power also means that we don't just jump and go to Nalergu and say we had money from the FCDO, so we are coming to do some work on girls' education, but that we co-create the projects with the citizens and go and look for funding to implement. It's very important because when you just bring in anything that is free, people don't value it. Anything that is imposed, people see it as, well, whether it works or not, it doesn't matter to us. But a co-creation enables you to have co-ownership. And so people see themselves, they see their efforts. Yes, we sat down with you and said we needed to do this whole thing about the granules farms because they provide income to women. And so we've come together, we have put in our money, you've also added some donor funding, and we're doing it. They see themselves in that. So to move towards co-creation. We talk about accountability and we think that it's, just go and say, we got $10 million, we spent $9 million, there's a balance of. Accountability is accountability not just for the funds, but for the resources. Why should you use $2 million to achieve what Education Directorate in Bunkurgu is achieving with less than 500,000 cities? If everybody had those $2 million, the Ghana wouldn't be where it is today. So accountability for the results that you achieve is also quite important. And being accountable in ways that people understand. So I don't take an audit report and go and give it to the women in Sefiri also and say, okay, I'm being accountable to you, so here's the audit report. They wouldn't make sense out of it. But that we reduce or we explain in ways that they understand what we use the money for, what we achieved, and what we think we should do moving forward. Talking to people in the languages and in the media that they understand. Okay, so again, we go back, monitoring for what? You see, monitoring is not just one thing. So Star Ghana, for example, maybe we are working with assembly women in the Brong-Ahafo region to amplify their voices, to make them more effective, maybe them be able to win elections. So when we are monitoring as Star Ghana because we are spending funds and etc. So we are looking at monitoring to look at, how the money was used, who did what. But the women we want to monitor, their indicators for success may be a bit different from ours. So a good monitoring system seeks to reconcile, the different monitoring needs. So if we are monitoring in the Brong-Ahafo region, Star Ghana is monitoring so that we can report to the donors. I think the District Assembly is monitoring so that to ensure that its activities are going on well. The women we are working with are monitoring to ensure that maybe their voices are being heard and etc. So a good monitoring system for me is one that seeks to harmonize all those things and recognizes the different perspectives. In addition, monitoring should be done by everybody. I don't go with this thing that only specialized people should do it. Two is to involve all stakeholders in the monitoring. So in the collection of the data, information, and etc. You don't just fly in, collect, and then go out, but that people, even on the ground, can help in the collection of the data. In the analysis of it, in making meaning, you need to bring in all stakeholders. There's one thing collecting the data. There's another thing seeing what are the implications. In Bolga, there was a study, they monitored, they realized that a lot of the women didn't want to give birth in the health facilities. Monitoring produced this thing that they said, if the child's umbilical cord was not buried in the house, then it meant that the child didn't belong to the house. Yes, and then we had a very amazing Director of Health, Dr. Awono Williams, who was in the Upper East at that time. And then he then said, look, when the woman gives birth, just give them just a rubber bag. They put the placenta inside, take it to the house and go and bury. And that immediately changed the dynamics. And women were willing to come and give birth. Of course, there were other factors. But if they hadn't looked at that perspective and looked at it from our perspective, they would have said, these illiterates, they don't understand anything. They don't want to do, let's go and do public education. And nothing would have changed. So that is how I see a good monitoring system. Well, when we talk of capacity strengthening programs, one of the biggest mistakes is to assume that people don't have capacity. So you are starting from zero. I think the first step in successful capacity building is to recognize that people have a certain level of capacity. And therefore, what you are coming to do is to build on it. The second, the ways in which we deliver, we love workshops, we love training programs, but capacity building can even be on the job. Capacity building can be actually mentoring. People see how you do things, you explain why you have to take this decision, and you are strengthening their capacities. If it is farmers, go out there, be with them, they are on the farms, and you are learning with them. The third actually is also to use people whose capacity you are building trust. Sometimes we send staff to go and work with farmers, and then they look at your palms and they say, you've never held a hoe or cutlass in your life. You can't identify with you. So these are people that, this thing should identify with. So let me start with the last one. I think if we look at LEAP, the Livelihoods Enhancement Against Poverty, LEAP started as a donor program. If we look at a lot of the girls' education initiatives, they initially started as donor initiatives, and then government took over. And if you look at some of the things around anti-corruption, a lot started as donor programs, and then government has taken over. We have Shraj monitoring and etc. So I think one, in terms of the successful donor programs, there are those that speak to an existing need, that where it doesn't speak to an existing need, it becomes very difficult. That people should know that we need something like this. And then when the program comes, it fits into that. Otherwise, it's seen as an imposition. So, not to sound controversial, but if you look at the discussion around the LGBTQ++, etc., the reaction of most Ghanaians is that this is a donor initiative. Whereas I think if it had been approached in ways in which we have had conversations about the fact that definitely there are people who have that kind of orientation. Should we slaughter them? What should we do in terms of prevention, in terms of accommodating those who are already there? It would have been seen as, look, Ghanaians, we are religious, we are etc., we are doing this. So I think that the most important lesson I've learned is that it should be seen as a locally initiated project or activity. Otherwise, it wouldn't fly. Well, I will start with a not so pleasant point, which is that in terms of the fundamentals, Ghana hasn't changed much from what we inherited at the time of independence. The economy is still largely focused on primary, commodities exports, very little industrialization, more outward-facing, economy, heavy reliance on imports and etc. So that broad context hasn't changed much. Within that, I think there have been some improvements, but not enough, in my opinion, to get us to the next level of development. So, of course, educational levels have improved. Gender parity has been attained, and in some areas we have even exceeded. Health indicators and outcomes have also improved. We've had a stable governance since 1992, and successful changes in governments, after elections and etc. So those have been, but I think fundamentally, the economy hasn't changed. The inequality is still, quite high, and poverty is deepening in some areas, both geographic, but also in terms of occupations. However, it's not all gloom. Since 92, very stable governance. But we've also attempted a very ambitious decentralization program that has sought to move governance to the doorstep of the population, and if implemented, would have been a game changer. But again, I think the implementation of the decentralization has been quite weak. The political will and incentives have not been there for us to do it properly. Education outcomes, whilst we have improved on enrollment, we have improved on gender parity and etc., we haven't really done so well on the education outcomes in terms of the quality of education and in terms of producing the kind of person power, human that we need to drive the economy forward. Health has improved, but you go to the rural areas and the situation is still not where we should be. So it is quite a checkered, context. We've made some progress, no doubt about it. But ask yourself, in terms of what they call the Gettysburg economy that we inherited at the time of independence and where we are now, what has significantly changed? We are not adding as much value to our primary products. We are still reliant on the big three, as they call them: cocoa, timber, and then gold or minerals, and so we are so susceptible to external shocks that as soon as there's a shock, whether it is Ukraine or it is tariffs or whatever it is, we've industrialized in some areas, but there's still a massive amount of work that needs to be done, that would have an economy that, adds value, that doesn't just export raw materials, but adds value and exports them, that we have an economy that services our needs. If you look at the kind of imports that we bring in, that even to the point where we are importing vegetables from Burkina Faso, which has a poorer agroecological landscape, you'll find out that there's still a lot for us to do, which is not to deny the fact that maybe some improvements have been made. We have a very active civil society. I think at the last count, in terms of those that registered with the not-for-profit organization secretariat, the NPO secretariat, I think we had gone beyond 10,000, So we have a very vibrant civil society sector. Unlike other countries, there isn't any overt attempts to suppress civil society, but it is still confronted with a number of challenges. It is almost completely reliant on external funding. And so the smallest shock or change in policy in the donor countries affects us disproportionately. Recently, when President Trump, shut down the United States Agency for International Development, it's led to a massive shock. NGOs are laying off staff, they can't do the work that they've been doing. And it's going through UK has reduced development funding, Netherlands has reduced. So that is the basic weakness of civil society, the civic sector in Ghana, that it is almost completely reliant on external aid. And you can't develop with external aid because you are subject to the vagaries of policy making and etc. from those areas. The media, started very well, particularly with the advent of democratic governance in 1992, where we saw, a springing up of so many, media organizations and channels. Now we have social media that has added to that. But I think where it hasn't done well has been to provoke constructive conversations around, our development. Why are we where we are now? Why are children in parts of the country not able to access, lying down on their stomachs to learn? Why are pregnant women still dying? Why are persons with disability largely excluded from our socio-political life? We're not having those conversations. We've turned the media, especially the traditional media, into mouthpieces of the political parties. So everything is about MPP, NDC. And some might say that politicians deliberately ensure that licenses for TVs, FM stations, were issued in such a way as to ensure that they had, avenues for propagating their lessons. So that's an area where the media hasn't done too well. But of course, we've seen the kind of investigative, journalism that some media houses have done and which have added to, improve our governance. Because of the challenges of our development, I mentioned at the beginning that we haven't substantially changed the economy much. So we are not generating the kind of jobs that are needed for the ever-increasing army of people who are coming out of school. The corruption that we have seen and all those things have in a way changed the dynamic in terms of young people's engagement with our governance. That they are disillusioned, they've not seen the democracy dividend. And so as a result, we are seeing a disengagement between young people and governance processes. Some are telling you that I won't vote, or it's the same thing, whether it's this government or the next government. Some even go to say that, look, we need a strong man, we need coup d'etat or whatever, and etc. And if you contrast this with the role that young people have played in the country's history, right from the time of independence, look at Kwame Nkrumah. At what age did he become the leader of government business? He was in his 30s, I'm not wrong. Most of those he came into office with were quite young people, the veranda boys and etc. If you look at Rawlings became our head of state, albeit through a coup d'etat at 33. If you look at the National Service Scheme, it was instituted through the advocacy of students. I was a student leader in 1982. We shut down the universities for 9 months to go and carry cocoa out of the hinterlands because the cocoa had been locked. If you know of the Ochireko Dam, if you know of Dawinya, students did a lot in the construction through just going out, voluntary labor, etc. These days, how many young people would go out and do those kind of things? And you don't blame them. One, the opportunities for them to volunteer are not there. Two, those in leadership are not setting a good example. And three, civil society is not mobilizing them to the extent that they need to be mobilized. So with the youth, I think we have that whole thing about the disengagement. With women, I think some progress has been made. We have a first woman vice president. We've passed the affirmative action, law. So there are opportunities to improve gender, representation at all levels of our development. So if you ask me, I think there are areas where we've made very significant decisions. But if we don't push, there is a danger that we'll backslide, we'll lose a lot of the gains that we made since 1992. Okay, so let me answer this with caution because I'm a member of the Constitutional Review Committee.
Oh.
And let me speak in my personal capacity that nobody sees that.
That disclaimer is very important.
Yes, nobody says that, oh, a member of the Constitution Review Committee has said that, But having said that, I think within limits, we need a sense of direction for this country. Like you rightly mentioned, you can't address the fundamental challenges of education over a 4-year period. You can't address the challenges of the economy over 4 years. You need a longer term. Then when Ghana made quite the most significant progress was when we had Kwame Nkrumah had a 7-year development plan that gave a certain room. So I accept that we need a broad national vision, but we shouldn't make it in such a way that it constrains the ability of successive governments to apply their own analysis to what needs to be done. What we need is a vision. Where do we want to go? Where do we want to see this country in the next 40, 50 years? The countries that have progressed, if you look at Singapore, if you look at Malaysia, if you look at even China, they had a national vision. And then this national vision was then broken down into maybe 10-year development plans and etc. And so I would say that we need to get the political parties to sit and we get consensus. Where do we want to go? Because if we don't have that consensus, whether it is JHS or it is O levels or it's whatever, it won't solve the problem. It is when you have the vision that you can see, to achieve that vision, we need this level of skilled manpower so that you don't get up overnight and turn all polytechnics into universities. So who is producing that middle and lower level, technical base that we need? So you want masons, we're importing them from Togo and Cote d'Ivoire. Most people who are building in Ghana now, and it's not even Accra, you go to Tamale, they are using artisans from the French-speaking countries. You want tailors, you want seamstresses for the fashion houses, they are bringing them from Nigeria and from the neighboring French-speaking countries. Now we are producing graduates, engineers, graduate whatever. Who is producing those technicians, So that is where I think that we need a broad national framework. But that should also be tied to, and again, I'm speaking as an individual, the tenure of our governments. Because 4 years, the president wins election, he spends the first year setting up his government, understanding what is there and etc. He or she, because we could have a female, the president spends the last year, campaigning for re-election. So essentially, you have 2 years of governance, What can you do in the 2 years, And so I think we need to look at that, because if we are looking at long-term planning, maybe we should be looking at the tenure. Should it be 5 years, 2 5-year terms? Some people are saying that, yes, if you get a good president, 2 5-year terms is okay. If you get a bad president, 10 years is a very long time for you to wait, and, But we need to have a conversation around that, so that the tenure of office of the president allows enough time to seed projects and to implement them. So maybe a 50-year development plan, and then within that 50-year plan, each government can come and then maybe develop the 5-year. I think in terms of the leadership principles, one is that I don't attempt to do everything. I am not a micromanager. Employ people you trust and trust them to do the work. Yes, so there's the whole thing about delegation. When you're employed, you had a terms of reference, isn't it? Do it. If you have challenges, I'll come in and support you. So that's the first thing. Delegation is there, but just allow people to do their work, but be there to support in case there's. But also realizing that if they are not performing, you take action. The second is that, I strike a balance between technical skills and values. If I'm interviewing you for a job, I would give maybe 40% to your technical competencies and 60% to your values and attitudes. We can always teach you the technical, but the values is difficult. So bring in somebody who has the right values, that the person is teachable, the person, is self-motivated, the person has a high sense of integrity. As for being able to manage the camera or to do whatever, we can teach you, we can train you to do it. So putting importance on the values. So the organization should have a set of values. People should come in with values. The fourth is, for me, don't take yourself too seriously. If you don't take yourself too seriously, you learn, even as a leader. You hear things, people come to you. But if you make yourself contained like that, then say, you are going to a largest office, and then that is already, So 2 challenges. One, managing the life-work balance. Yes, whenever we talk about that balance, we always think about women and of course they are more affected. But even for the men, especially when my family was quite young, that was also the time when I was stepping into areas that I didn't have a clue about. And so I needed to learn and whilst working, and which meant that I spent 90% of my time at work. Yes, and that was actually to the detriment of a young family. That was children who needed me at that time, and I think that was the most difficult. And I'll always tell my staff that if you fall down dead today, within 2 minutes we'll bring somebody in an acting capacity, but your children will not be able to get somebody in an acting capacity for you. So to strike that balance, I think that's been the most important lesson that I've learned. The second lesson has been not to run away from challenges. When I joined CARE, like I told you at the beginning, I trained as an accountant. CARE employed me as the manager of a food security project. I had no clue what is food security, what food security they say. I learned enough to go and pass the interview, the recruitment interview. Then I came back, and the CARE principle was that the head office was in Accra. I was based in Tamale. Go and do the work. So what I did was that I went around Tamale asking you, have you done food security? Food security and this thing before. If you say no, I say okay, I'll talk to you later. Boss, have you done this thing before? I say yes. Okay, tell me. And that was how I learned. And within 3 years, we had doubled the funding of that project. So first, I could have told myself that I'm not an expert in food security, so I wouldn't even apply, I wouldn't even go. The second would have been that, they asked me to go and do the job, and then I feel too big as a manager to go and ask people to teach me how to do it. So I think those two were kind of the biggest experiences, most challenging, but most rewarding for me First, education that is fit for purpose. So we train people, we educate people to come out and be able to do things for themselves. I think the focus has been, if people come out of school and expect government jobs, there is simply no way. And we're creating artificial jobs that are not sustainable in this country. Where is the entrepreneurship spirit? Where is the support? So I think the first is education that fits our vision for Ghana. That's the first. The second is that the youth feel very disempowered. How do we empower them? Enable, create spaces for them to be able to participate in governance. Just trying to be constructive or objective at this stage. But I quite like the number of young people that have been appointed by the current government. If they are given the mentoring and the support, because it's one thing saying that, the young people need to be empowered. So you give somebody a position and you don't provide the support, he or she will mess up. And then we turn around and say, young people are not able to do this A, B, C, D, E. So I think that we should create opportunities for them to be able to have voice. And the last one, which again, I'm not speaking as a member of the Constitutional Review Committee, 70% of our population is 35 and below, right? So the majority of our voters are 35 and below. Why do you say that before you become a president, you must be 40 and above or 45 and above? No, I'm not talking about that. So I think we should just create the conditions that enable young people to take, leadership and take responsibility and to support them. If we don't, we've seen what is happening in the Sahel. People would come and turn their minds, and before we realize, we have extremist organizations create a sense that young people see Ghana as a place where there are opportunities for them. So that the next Afro Barometer or whatever, we don't have 70% plus saying that if they got the opportunity, they will leave the country. That's very dangerous for us.